Welcome everyone to News in the Money World. Rupert Carline, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Darcy?
Very good. You have one of those names where you can't say just the first name. You have to say your last name as well. So it's always Rupert Carline.
Oh,
I
I'm
don't know
good at
why.
that.
Yeah,
No,
I
but to
didn't.
be fair, it's a hard name to say. So the more people that I can get to say it publicly, maybe I'll start to get it referred to properly in the future as well.
Yeah, simple. Car Lion. Simple,
Well,
right? It's
that's
like
what I
pineapple
think.
thin. Yeah.
I went through my final gripe before we get into it. I went through the entire high school without a single teacher ever being able to say it properly, including the English teachers, believe it or not.
Well, how could you stuff it up? It's like what? What are the variations? Carleon?
Carleon's the big one. All these people that trying to be fancy, they just don't realize that I'm just a basic down to earth person. They just try
Yeah.
and make my name fancy.
Yeah, it's just meat and three veg. That's all you are. So
Exactly.
yeah, let's keep it real. So in the spirit of keeping it real, let's just talk about some real facts rather than just like what we would like to see happen. Let's just talk about what is. And in New Zealand here, makes sense that we start from the inside out. So let's start
Yeah,
New Zealand. Last week we had a really interesting week. Oh, I guess it was kind of interesting. Not really interesting. I shouldn't say really interesting. I'm overselling it, aren't I? The
it was
official
good.
cash rate. Yeah. So the official cash rate, the OCR, didn't increase, stayed the same, 5.5%. Big deal. What is the big deal, I think, is that the tone, the hawkish overtones, and
Yeah.
your your views on this. I know we've probably covered this already, but the the inflation problem hasn't been solved. The Reserve Bank is
Uh,
now suggesting that that's the case. Before we get stuck into what's happening this week, which I think is probably more relevant than last week, your views on monetary policy with what the Reserve Bank is doing right now, would you say it's good, bad, or otherwise?
Look, I think it's pretty otherwise. I don't think it's good. I don't think it's particularly bad. I think they are fighting a pretty tough fight. I think they are doing a good job at trying to keep the market honest. The market's desperate to get ahead of itself and kind of lower interest rates and ease financial conditions, which is only going to make their job hard. So, look, I think the commentary around rate cuts not through to September next year, fuck, that's pretty scary as a rather large mortgage holder sitting in the seat right now.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that, look, I'd be surprised if we get there. I think there's definitely a fair amount of jawboning happening. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the other big uncertainty that they have is what the government's going to do on Thursday, right? I think most economists have agreed that the tax cuts will be inflationary. The question is how big their spending offsets are going to be. So I think there might be a little bit of keeping their powder dry for that as well and going, hey, look, we don't want to kind of post budget. We're not going to specifically say government policy is what drove us to where we are. But I think they're kind of getting people prepared to, hey, higher for longer as a result of some of these budget settings as well would be potentially my view. So uh, I don't think it's. I thought it was pretty scary as a mortgage holder. I don't think they're going to have the luxury to hold interest rates that high for as long as they do, because I do think the economy is in a much worse state. So I do still think we're looking at interest rates cuts happening this year. But yeah, it'll be interesting to kind of see. The one data point that I did read from one of the bank economists was the OCR has never ever stayed as high as the Reserve Bank expects. All of a sudden, it kind of, I know we've talked about this before, right? Things go up in steps and they come down in elevators, and the economy it will start deteriorating. It will start deteriorating pretty quickly. At which point the Reserve Bank will move pretty quickly, but they can't really predict when and how that's going to happen.
Yeah. Let's go back to these tax cuts. So your view is that, and like you say, a lot of people would have the same view that these tax cuts will be inflationary. And just to pick that apart a little bit, so there's going to be a significant amount of job losses in the public sector, which is going to be really quite hard for those families, especially that
Yeah.
depend on government spending. But if we look just generally, and no disrespect to those government employees, but generally speaking, that type of work that government doesn't necessarily create more productivity. It can sometimes maybe kind of, but what's happening in my view is that really we're shutting down the public spending at the same time that we're allowing more private spending to occur. But the private spending occurs in a way which in theory, should be a little bit more efficient than government spending. And so, like, my view on that would be, from an inflationary perspective, is that it's going to hurt, but it is a necessary change to get the balance right between how much government we have in our lives and this whole kind of fear that a shrinking government will somehow cripple our country. I think is probably founded on a belief that more government is always better, more control, more safety, right? But I do kind of think that we've got out of balance in that area, probably over the last 4 years in particular, and I kind of see that these tax cuts, shrinking of the government, this sort of spirit of austerity is unpleasant but necessary. You don't have those views, though, would be my suspicion, Rupert. Would that be
Uh,
true?
I'm halfway with you.
You're halfway.
Um,
I'll take
I'm
it. I'll
halfway
take it.
there, right? I firmly believe that there was a lot of dumb spending going on, and that we definitely need to cut government spending. There's no question on that, right? I think people deserve tax cuts. At the end of the day, the tax brackets haven't been changed since 2010. That's atrocious. The number of people that are now sitting in those high tax brackets. I'm not convinced that now is the right time to deliver the tax relief. And for the very simple purpose, right? Two things are driving inflation. One is the easy money that was available to everyone, governments and consumers 2 or 3 years ago, over the last kind of 3 to 5 years.
Mm.
The second piece that's driving a lot of inflation is the fact that the government is continuing to spend way too much money. So this year, the government deficit's expected to be 6 to 7% of GDP. I think the budget will show it's probably coming down to 4 or 5% of GDP. And we've got another 2 or 3 years of deficits. So the problem we have is we still have a government spending more than it's making. And so effectively, they're putting more money into the economy at a time when we want the government to be taking, when the Reserve Bank is trying to take money out of the economy. So my prescription, if we were focused on inflation and we wanted inflation to come down, as a government, what I would be doing is I would be putting through a lot of the cuts and the austerity cuts that we are talking about, but I would be delaying the tax. And I would be saying, cool, we're happy to go into a tax cut world the moment that inflation hits our 2.5% or 3% target. I'm not saying delay it and we can make it, just linking those two to make it contingent, because fundamentally all we are doing by giving those tax cuts right now is it means the government is still going to be printing far more money than they earn. And we all know that that is what was one of the big drivers of inflation. So that's why I say halfway. I agree with you on the spending cuts. I agree philosophically on the tax needing to come back. But now is just not the right time to do it until we've got inflation under control.
I think that whole soft landing analogy is really quite good when you think about it in the context of this discussion, because when the plane comes in for a landing, the nose comes up a little bit to slow it down. Then you'll hear the pushing the throttle forward. So they have these counterbalancing forces all of the time that are being engineered by one pilot to create that soft landing. And it doesn't make sense, does it, that interest rates are really high to suck currency out of the system to relieve this price pressure, inflation, at the same time that the government is allowing more money to stay in the system through tax cuts. In my mind, I kind of just see that as, hey, they've lowered the flaps. That's going to create drag. They've put the landing gear down, more drag. They're going to increase the throttle a little bit just to create that perfect touchdown. That's my hope anyway. Could be wrong.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Yeah, look, it'll be interesting to see, right? And I mean, I hope I'm wrong, and I hope we still do get our interest rates cut this year. But it just feels a little bit counterintuitive at the moment. I'm also very curious to see some of the other stuff that we're going to see in this budget, right? Because we've been flagged a whole lot of bits and pieces. Two things to me. One is we've been flagged the idea of extra revenue. So I'll be very curious to see where that's going to come from. So they are staying very tight-lipped about some of those revenue things. And we're already starting to see, so what are some of these other programs that we're looking to be cut as well, right? So Kāinga Ora is going to be a big one with a lot of their funding kind of withdrawn. Kiwi Rail, their funding withdrawn. A lot of the public transport initiatives. I actually think the spending cuts that we're about to see will be bigger than others. I won't necessarily agree with a whole lot of them because of kind of where I sit on the political spectrum.
Yeah.
But at the
And that's
same
okay,
time,
Rupert. That's okay.
that's why we work, Darcy, because we're not the same.
That's right.
But at the same time, I am very curious to kind of see where and what it comes. And I think it is kind of unfortunate, right? Because I do suspect a lot of what we will see and what we're doing, they are kind of, hey, very, very short term fixes and very short term where we go. And have we forgotten how to be strategic about New Zealand? That's one of the things I was hoping for from a corporate CEO, was someone that's kind of willing and able to be strategic and go, well, what is New Zealand's niche and how do we create a 3, 5, 10-year plan to allow New Zealand to prosper? And I'd kind of given up all hope that we're going to see something like that.
Yeah, like I just hope he's busy in the background doing something. But it's it's wishful thinking as well, to be honest. I don't put much hope in
Yeah.
politicians these days, but there's three things, right? In terms of this whole new revenues thing that I was just thinking about last night, because I read the budget from, I read a budget report from a couple of months ago, that Treasury Bureau, I think it was, and they discussed this whole new revenues thing. And so I just kind of tried to do a little bit of thinking about this. So there's three levers that I understand in terms of how the government makes money. And
Yep.
just to preface this by the fact that the government is the only member of this conversation here that doesn't actually have to prove value before they get paid. They can just get paid first. We actually have to do this podcast, right? Before we get any value out of it. They just demand it, and it's fantastic. Anyway, taxation. We're overtaxed as a nation. Tax cuts coming through. Covered that already. David Seymour is potentially pushing through more aggressive tax cuts than what National had indicated. Maybe. Who knows? Borrowing. They can go out to the market. They can get people to invest, buy government bonds, or they can print it. And there's complicated shell games to mask how that works, and it's complicated to explain, and that's kind of by design. But those are the three levers of new revenues that I understand. And so if they're thinking that they're going to get into doing some side hustles, creating some jams, maybe milking some, I don't know what they're going to do to actually increase their revenues. Maybe it's, I don't know, China Belt and Road Initiative. Maybe that kicks off some new revenues. What are your thoughts? Like, what do you think they could do to actually increase revenue and earn money instead of actually just scraping it away from you and I?
Look, I'm really curious, right? So we've already seen little things, right? So they've talked about increasing the international visitor levy. There'll be a whole lot of levies, and they've already done it, to be fair. So there's the international visitor levy. They've put up immigration fees. I suspect some of the stuff around public transport and some of the subsidies that are going into various things will get cut. I think they're going to be very ruthless about moving as much as they can back onto the private sector, which I actually agree with, by the way. And I think kind of we subsidize too many industries in too many different ways. And so moving these costs back onto the private sector is quite a good thing. So, yeah, I think there'll be lots and lots of little levies and things that we see, right? Yeah, and that's going to be small ways that we can get more funding out of them. I mean, actually, the other one that we've already seen is NZTA increasing road user charges. Yeah, there's just lots of bits and pieces like that I think they can do, which is going to increase their revenue side.
Mm-hmm.
On the austerity one, though, the one thing actually that has been going through my mind in the last little wee while, and we do need to be pretty careful on it, is we just got to remember what happened in the UK. So coming out of 2009, 2008, global financial crisis, UK Conservative Party came into government in 2009, 2010, and went on a kind of a 4-year austerity binge. And that just absolutely hammered the UK and really reinforced the social divide of the haves and the have-nots. And we kind of see that happening in New Zealand at the moment. And that was kind of what was the end result of that? Brexit. Because you ended up with a very unhappy population who are desperately looking for someone to blame for their unhappiness. And so I think we just need to be very mindful as we go through this rejigging of our economy and the sorting out of our government finances. We need to be extremely mindful of the social impacts, because there are a lot of examples through history where we see that actually austerity and government kind of trying to move quickly to change the kind of the economic makeup of an economy, creates carnage. Well, actually, in New Zealand, let's go back to the 1980s and early 1990s, where New Zealand was basically in or out of recession for about 15 years. It's not pretty and can cause massive social unrest as well. So I think that's one of the areas we need to be a bit careful on.
That's a good reminder, eh? And I think whenever there's like a massive mix up or shake up in the fiscal side or on the monetary side, whether it be taxation and government spending, or whether it be cash rate adjustments and other credit adjustments there, you create this shaking that goes on, and it always separates the material in that space, right? And you're right, yeah, like that increases the likelihood. It's just like, well, who are we going to be angry against next? That's what I'm worried about. Which team are we going to be on, right? Are we going to be the ones that are going to be in trouble because we're asset owners? So will it be those who own assets and those who don't? Probably, right?
Yeah, look, it's going to be tough, right? And I think, we can't underestimate how hard it is going to be over the next kind of 12, 24 months for many, many, many parts of New Zealand.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, moving along to other toughness. Once upon a time, I'd look at my midsection, think that was pretty tough, but now it's a little bit flabby. And that kind of is like a really good picture of the demographic bulge, as well, as a lot of countries in the West are facing this bulge, right? And it's interesting because I think it's fascinating that as the money contains less purchasing power over time, more people have to work, the whole act of procreation kind of falls by the wayside. We don't start producing enough people to repopulate our countries. So we bring more in. It's the easy lever to pull. We bring more immigration in. That creates more societal divide because the type of people that we bring in aren't necessarily the type of people that mix as well. Sometimes it's oil and water. It is what it is. And that causes even more of an issue, but it does solve the immediate pain of trying to increase our tax base so that we can support the pyramid scheme, right? Keep up with the superannuation, keep up with all the services. How do we support our aging population apart from immigration, though? That's my question.
Fuck, it is an amazing, amazing, amazing question. And I think it's something that, look, The Economist and a few other publications that I read are starting to spend a lot of time talking about. I mean, New Zealand, to a certain extent, we are lucky. We're not like China, right, where they're expected to have over the next 40, 50 years, their population basically go in half. Korea, again, they're expected to have their population go in half. In New Zealand, though, what it does mean is we've got some massive, massive fiscal headwinds that it's going to create. So just throwing out some round numbers at you. Today, New Zealand, 32% of our GDP is tax, right? So we kind of pay that to the government. With some other kind of random numbers, about I think it's 7.5% of our GDP is in healthcare. So let's call that 20% of our total tax cake goes into healthcare. We've got NZ Super, which is another 4.5% of GDP. So let's call that kind of 18, 19% of our total tax take. So these are two line items that make up, or let's call it close to kind of 45% of our overall kind of tax take, that are expected to get materially bigger over the next 15 to 20 years. The estimates are that between those two items, those numbers are going to go from kind of in the low 40s up to kind of 50% in the next 20 to 30 years, at the same time as we've got much fewer workers to support all of those kind of people. So it is a massive fiscal issue that is coming. And I hate to say it, the only way that we are going to be able to solve this problem is A, if we're willing to recognize it and acknowledge that there is a big issue, and B, we're going to have to move to user pays on a whole lot of this kind of stuff, right? So Australia's given us the right model on superannuation, where they've got a model where they provide support for the people that really need it and can't save during their working life. But with a combination of incentives and compulsion, they're actually forcing people and making people save a really good sum of money for their retirement. And so that's kind of, KiwiSaver was meant to do that, but we're only kind of halfway there. So we need to kind of means test NZ Super, but also use KiwiSaver as an incentive to give people a kicker. Healthcare, I think, is actually a much harder conversation. We spend our kind of all of the science and technology at the moment is about creating new solutions to let people live longer and have people live longer. I don't think anyone's actually thought about the cost of that, because each of these new solutions is very, very expensive. And keeping people alive longer also comes with its own costs. And so, again, I think it needs to become a bit of a user pays system, right? Where we have national insurance, similar to the UK, where actually all of you put your money into kind of a pot, and actually it's almost a state sponsored insurance scheme that you drag down on each and every year. But I do think the way that we are currently doing it is going to have to change, because there is just no way that our population in 20 years' time is going to be able to support that elderly population and the health and superannuation requirements that they have.
Yeah. And kind of like, I guess, tying into the fact that there probably will be those who have assets, those who are
Yep.
already wealthy, they will get wealthier. So we know that the capability of some of the population is definitely there. So do they really need government superannuation? It's not really going to move the needle, right?
No.
Do they really need public health care when they have millions potentially in resource that they could liquidate to pay for it? Do they really need to draw down on the public education system when they're paying for their grandkids or their kids to go into private schools? So to me, it kind of feels like, hey, because of the cost that the government has to bear, no matter what, it's not means tested and they just give it out willy nilly. On the other side, they probably don't really appreciate that benefit. So it costs more on one side than the benefit that's being received on the other. So to me, it kind of sounds like a simple exercise of carving that out. If it's user pays, there should also be tax deductions for retirement better. So KiwiSaver contributions should have much better tax treatment. Healthcare, so if you're paying medical insurance premiums, they should be tax deductible.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
education, if you're paying extra, this is probably where it will depart. But if you're paying extra to send your kids to a better school, which doesn't teach your kids all sorts of stuff that you don't agree with, then maybe those premiums or those school fees should be tax deductible as well. What are your thoughts?
Oh, 100%. I
Two out of
think
three or three out of three?
that's 3 out of 3.
Oh,
Um,
sweet. Surprised.
I think fundamentally people should be encouraged to alleviate. Oh, sorry. We need to encourage people to alleviate the burden on the state.
Yeah.
And the way we do that is by creating incentives. And I think you're 100% right. Education, healthcare, superannuation, all three things that actually, I think if we put the right incentives in place, we would encourage people to move to the private systems versus the public systems.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm glad you said that. So, when I start running for the ACT Party in next election, you just keep that in mind, Rupert.
I
It's
thought you
good.
were bringing the libertarians across from the US.
Who said that I didn't already do it? They might be living under the stairs.
Ah,
Anyway, let's zoom out though. Speaking of the U.S. and speaking of China, speaking of tit for tat, there is definitely a decent chunk of tit for tat. There's a lot of, I was going to say a lot of titties, a lot of tatties. There is, and there's this increasing kind of escalation towards this trade war that I guess you could say Donald Trump started it. Biden's continuing it and is probably not going to show any signs of letting up anytime soon, right? And I heard it described recently, I can't remember where it was, but it's kind of like you're sitting in a boat or a submarine and a gunfight breaks out. And if somebody's shooting a gun at you inside a submarine, well, they're really kind of screwing it up for everybody, right? But if you shoot back, it doesn't make things better. It just means that you're going to die a whole lot faster. And that's kind of a way to describe a trade war. I can't see any other way out of trade wars other than the fact that things just get a lot more expensive. And some domestic businesses will do really well as reshoring occurs. But to a certain extent, everything's going to become a lot more expensive. And so what's that going to do to inflation? So what are your thoughts just generally around trade wars? Who actually wins?
I mean, look, I don't think anyone wins. I know the consumer definitely loses, because, as you say, things do get more expensive. It does mean that we end up kind of with higher inflation as a result of it. So, look, the consumer definitely loses. What I haven't quite got clear in my head, though, the consumer loses, does the worker win? Which actually means that potentially it comes out as a little bit of a net net. There's some interesting stuff I've been reading on it, though, that overall it generally does result in lower growth, does result in lower productivity, because actually what we want is we want the most effective and efficient producer producing. Um, the same thing that often happens as well is we end up with, what's the words? You kind of end up with these whole series of unintended consequences on the tariffs. And a good example was given by an economist the other day, where they talked about back in the 1980s, they put tariffs on washing machines. 20% tariff on washing machines because Europe had figured out how to produce them pretty cheaply and we're importing them into the US. So they put the tariffs on. But actually, what the retailers and the producers of washing machines managed to do is they put the prices of not just washing machines up kind of 20%, but they put washing machines, dryers, and dishwashers all up 20% because they're all meant to be priced on parity. And so you end up with these quite big unintended consequences, which make things pretty difficult. So hence why the consumer loses. But the one thing that I haven't quite got clear in my head at the moment is I look at what's happening in the US, I look at what's happening in China, where they've got this massive growth happening and very low levels of unemployment. And they're really going back to kind of a very strong manufacturing base, almost harking back to the kind of the 1970s and the 1980s. And that's, I mean, if you think about the Chinese economy, it is what the Americans were back in the 1970s.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I think, and I look at kind of the story that we all hear about at the moment as American exceptionalism. And let's be honest, that American exceptionalism is driven by the strength of the consumer, all the savings from COVID that should run out in a minute. Though we've been saying that for 12 months, so who knows when or if it does. But it's also been driven by that kind of $2 or $3 trillion worth of stimulus, which has gone into American manufacturing. It's created a lot of jobs, built a lot of factories. And yeah, I look, I know I'm not meant to say this, but I do wonder if that's a good thing or a bad thing. On balance, I'm starting to think maybe it's a good thing. I mean, I look at little old New Zealand, right, where we don't have any manufacturing, we don't have any industries. We've actually got nothing really that the government can support. And what do, right? We actually have no options, whereas at least the Americans have shown a way that you can actually drive growth through. So, yeah, look, consumers will lose in the short term, but I haven't quite made up my mind yet whether it's a good or bad thing in the medium term.
And when I just about said when Trump gets in, I just I wonder how this evolves, right? Like, is that trend towards, say, deglobalization, we'll call that, will deglobalization accelerate if Trump gets in? Because like last time he was in, that certainly seemed like making America great again was the absolute priority, and in a way he definitely made America great again in some areas, but this time it's going to have to be a new proposition. Like, so far we know he's definitely pro crypto now. Definitely wasn't before last time, so something's changed there. But will he accelerate this trend of deglobalization? And if so, will that be done in more of a friendly way, in that the trading partners that they should be bolstering their ties with, like Canada, Mexico, England, Australia, New Zealand, we should all be quite unified during this time as a bipolar world starts to manifest itself. We should be trading as a bigger block. If we're going to be dominated by US Fed policy, which we kind of are, it would be good to know that on the economic side, we're a lot more aligned rather than there's these barriers up. So which way do you think this globalization or deglobalization thing will go? Can you see that pattern happening as well, where maybe it's like there's a trade war between the BRICS nations, the other side, but within our side, there's maybe lower barriers?
No, short answer, because I think everything that we've seen he, from what I've seen, he doesn't really prioritize friends. He doesn't have any friends. It's a short answer. Everything is transactional. And he doesn't mind who he wins or loses against as long as he wins, whether it's a win against New Zealand, a win against Canada, win against Mexico, or a win against Russia.
Right.
For him, every transaction has a winner and has a loser. And I think that's the bit that's going to be really tough, right? We saw it last time with all of the tough talk on Europe and NATO.
Yeah.
Even kind of still is pretty friendly towards Russia. So, look, I think, yeah, it is. That's why I kind of, as nice as it would be to say, does New Zealand fall underneath this nice little US led kind of world? No, short answer. I just kind of think he has shown that for him, there are winners and there are losers in the world, and he will do whatever he can to make sure that the US wins. He's not
Right.
out to do anyone any favors.
So unless we are part of that strategy to win, forget about it, is what you're
Yep.
saying. Yeah.
Um, and then, yeah, so it's a really tough one, right? And that's why
Yeah.
New Zealand, I think, so one of the things that we have seen is so as international trade starts to reduce and trade gets harder, that becomes really, really hard for New Zealand because we've got an open trading economy in the bottom of the world, which basically just relies on open markets because we don't do manufacturing, we don't have production, we don't actually have a huge amount here, apart from our agricultural exports and our tourism industries. And so that's where I think it's going to get really interesting, right? In this new world, where does New Zealand sit? Um, and that's going to be the challenge, right? Australia's kind of managed to, I think, navigate it probably better than anyone in the last kind of 5 or 10 years. They've been very pro-American. They've got themselves been very clear with China that they will do what they want. Economic policy is independent of foreign policy, and to be fair, they've got away with it the whole way through. My question is the reason why Australia's got away with that is because they've got coal and iron ore, which is China desperately need. Does China desperately need our milk and our logs and our wine, or are they happy to turn that stuff off?
Mm, interesting. Okay. Yeah. Well, I think this is where it'll be interesting to see whether or not New Zealand's foreign policy, economic policy, the slightly different tilts that we've adopted, will that bear fruit in a new global order? Because the world is being reordered, so we don't know which way it'll go yet. And I guess things like India, China, right there, I wonder just how New Zealand can position itself to benefit economically as well as stay, at least from a defense point of view, somewhat aligned to the US. Tricky waters to navigate, though, right?
Oh, very, very tricky waters. And particularly, yeah, it's going to be really, really interesting to see how and where we go, right? I
Yeah.
mean, the other thing is, or do we take the lead of Singapore, which is basically you stay violently independent and you stay out of everything? There's a lot of people that kind of, there's this very strong argument which say we shouldn't be joining the US blocks, we shouldn't be joining Chinese blocks, we just need to sit on the sidelines and kind of let it all play out with some popcorn on the side.
Yeah. That's very tempting. Very tempting. Man, okay. There's tons to there's kind of tons to probably unpack still around this. But as we finish up, I want to just really quickly touch on banks' profitability.
Yeah.
When you look at any bank or any really, really awesome, profitable, monopolistic business, usually you see a squiggly line that starts from the bottom left and goes to the top right. And that's exactly what describes the bank's profits over the past few years. It's been, quite envious. Looking at that, looking at my balance sheet is or my statement of performance, a little bit more subtle in increases to my income, but the banks they're doing really well, and I find it fascinating just to see that this is coming out around a period of time where there's increasing what I would call misinformation around distribution channels for mortgage lending in Australia and in New Zealand, where clearly there's somebody with an agenda to push some negative light on mortgage advisors. And I've read an article recently out of I think it was one of the articles from an Australian publication, just talking about how the banks in Australia are going to be pushing their direct channels a little bit more to the consumers. And I find that quite interesting that that's all happening during a period of time where there's a bit more scrutiny being put on their profit margins because they're not making enough money, presumably, is the reason why they're doing that. So I understand that it's not necessarily their fault. They are in this position and there is a higher purpose, a monetary authority sits above them who really does know what's going on and really does need to control where interest rates go. So I guess profitability in my mind is probably just a byproduct of where monetary policy goes. But what are your views? Is there a reason why banks need to be profitable, or is this really just raping and pillaging wealth out of New Zealand?
Look, banks do need to be profitable. There's no question on it, right? Banks, if we're using their profits to reinvest, lending, all of that kind of good stuff, right? If they are not profitable, then they very quickly withdraw on lending, which creates much bigger problems as well. The big question is, what is a fair level of profitability? Around the world, average return on equity for a bank is anywhere between 10 to 12%. So return on equity, that means the kind of the amount of return for every dollar of equity. So 10 cents, 10 to 12 cents of return of profit for every dollar of equity that you have invested in the bank is kind of what seems to be fair. Ours are currently operating anywhere in that 13 to 15% range. So significantly higher than global averages, significantly higher than actually the Australian parents as well. And so there's no question on it, right, that the banks are extremely profitable. And it's really interesting, right? A lot of the chat and the conversations that are currently being had, right, about the levels of profitability and why they're being so profitable. That's being blamed on higher equity ratios for the banks. That's bullshit. That doesn't impact the return on equity. It means their total profits need to be bigger, but not their return on equity. They're kind of then moving to the advice channels. It's great kind of diversionary tactics. The truth is, our banks are exceptional at figuring out and charging little bits and pieces of fees to their clients. It's amazing that we are one of the only countries in the world left that does not yet have open banking. Why do we not have it? Because the banks are saying, oh, it's too hard, we can't be bothered. Any other regulator in the world would have turned around and gone, you have to sort that out, and that has to be sorted out like tomorrow. You don't have 5 years to kind of get it done while you build out your fintech offerings. We have a Commerce Commission that's currently looking at kind of the banking sector. What are they looking at though? They're looking at personal banking, which we kind of know is actually pretty competitive at the personal side. What they're not looking at is they're looking at SME banking. When I was in the UK, I spent a couple of years breaking up banks post GFC. And the gold mine that every single person wanted to get their hands on, the SME bank, because SME banking was very high margin, very high fees, and that is kind of where the core of it all went. Unfortunately, our Commerce Commission is not looking at that side of it, right? Little things like the $15 FX charge that you get paid, that you get charged whenever you send money overseas, the 1% kind of margin on the FX, the 2% paywave margin. All of these are big costs, and everyone goes, but they're charged to businesses, who cares? The problem is the business then charges them onto consumers. So it all comes on the way through. So fundamentally, I think at the moment, we've got a banking system that isn't working because it is not competitive enough, but we're unwilling to have a real conversation about how to make it more competitive.
And it just increases the chance that when there is change, the change will be fast, right? Like if we keep on going down this current path and not evolving, it increases the odds that there will be an evolutionary event which catches possibly a lot of people off guard in terms of like swapping over to a new regime where all of a sudden there's open banking, all of a sudden there's transparency, and we can see where the money actually goes. That's not going to be good either, right? When people actually realize what's going on, because right now they're kind of thinking that the battle line
No,
is really somewhere
and
else.
it will be really interesting, right? Because I 100% agree. Because it's actually getting the transactional stuff out of the banks, which is going to save a huge amount of money. And that's what open banking will allow. But it's just truly amazing that they've managed to hold it off for so long.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, it will happen, and it will happen quickly. The problem, the other flip side to it, though, is all the banks need to do the moment they think they're going to lose it is they just drop their prices
Yeah.
and make it a whole lot harder for everyone else.
Yeah, well, that's monopolistic behavior, but I guess that's the beauty of transformational change, is that it can happen so fast that it can even surpass that, because there's just such a big value gap in terms of the value that they're adding and what they're charging for it. And so I think a lot of these frustrated fintechs that are struggling away with their futile efforts, it might feel, to actually compete with the banks, I think a time will come where things flip. Or I'm hopeful for that, for their perspective and
Yeah,
for everybody's perspective, because we need banks, but I do think that there's this fear or this reluctance to change because it's uncertain, and they're naturally risk averse. They'll want profits with very little certainty. And so if you increase the
oh,
uncertainty to get the profits, that doesn't fit the model. So I can totally understand it, but something has to change at some stage.
100%.
Cool. Man, okay. Tax cuts. We've talked about spending cuts, new revenues. What are they? Global problem, superannuation, health. How do we make changes as a country? What's going to happen this year in the election in terms of globalization, and why are banks profitable? That's a few things we ticked off the list today, Rupert. Well done. Good job.
Oh, look, it's well, we're sort of like very quiet. We talked about this before we came online. A very quiet time in terms of the markets.
Yeah.
There's kind of not a huge amount happening right now. It's just we're on that nice, easy march north, and that's why we're having to divert to some of these bigger,
Yeah.
broader problems. But it's great
Yeah.
conversation.
Well, it's good. It's just like anything, right? Like sometimes you just get down and you just do some work. You don't think about what's happening out there. You just get stuck into doing some work, because when things change, you got to be in the right position to meet that opportunity head on, right? So I think with a lot of these issues that we've talked about, some of them are well beyond our control as citizens, but as business people and as households, we can think about things like just health, education, and how we're running our own households so that we can be more resilient. And that's what investing is all about. So good chat. Thanks, Rupert.
Awesome.
See you
Okay.
next
Well,
week.
thanks, Darcy. And we'll
Cool.
speak next week.